Have you ever just stopped and wondered what you're actually made of? I don't mean in a philosophical sense, but like chemically. What are the raw ingredients that make you, you? Well, today we're going to get right into the chemistry behind our biology.
So, let's start with a big question. What's the real chemical difference between you and, say, a rock? It sounds almost like a joke, right? But seriously, both you and the Earth's crust are built from the exact same elements on the periodic table. So if the ingredients are the same, how come one of them is alive and the other is, well, a rock?
Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting. Take a look at these numbers. Oxygen, yeah, it's the top element in both us and the planet's crust. But then look at carbon. It's just a tiny, tiny fraction of the Earth's crust, 0.03%, but it makes up a whopping 18.5% of your body. And hydrogen does a similar crazy jump. Meanwhile, silicon, which makes up more than a quarter of the Earth's crust, is pretty much a no-show in us.
So here's the bottom line. Life isn't about using some kind of special, magical elements. It's about taking the same elements and using them in completely different proportions. This huge abundance of carbon and hydrogen, that's the chemical signature of life. It's this unique recipe that separates us from the very ground we walk on.
So, here's our game plan. We've just seen how living matter stacks up against the Earth. Next, we're going to look at how scientists actually figure this recipe out. Then we'll meet the master molecules of life, do a deep dive into proteins and their superpowered cousins, enzymes. And finally, we'll put the whole picture of you together.
So that begs the question, right? How do we get this neat little list of ingredients for a living thing? Well, it all comes down to some pretty classic chemical analysis. Scientists have a surprisingly straightforward way to break down living tissue and sort out all its chemical parts.
Believe it or not, it's basically a three-step process. First, you take a piece of living tissue, like a piece of liver or a vegetable, and you grind it up with some trichloroacetic acid. Yeah, sounds a bit messy. This makes a thick slurry. Then you strain it through something simple, like cheesecloth, and that simple act of straining is what separates everything into two very different groups.
And from that, you get two distinct fractions. The liquid that drips through is called the acid-soluble pool, and it's full of thousands of tiny little molecules. But the stuff that gets left behind in the cheesecloth, the acid-insoluble fraction, that's where the real heavy hitters are. This is where we find the big, complex molecules that are the true building blocks of our cells.
So let's focus on that gunk left in the cheesecloth, the acid-insoluble fraction. This stuff contains what scientists call biomacromolecules. And these are the four titans of biology, the absolute master molecules of life.
Now, what exactly is a biomacromolecule? The name sounds complicated, but the idea is pretty simple. They're just huge. To give you some perspective, a single molecule of water weighs about 18 daltons. These guys weigh 10,000 daltons or more. They're absolute giants, and they're all polymers, which just means they're long chains built from smaller, repeating parts. And these giants fall into four main categories. You've got your proteins, which are the versatile workers. You have polysaccharides, also known as carbohydrates, which provide fuel and structure. Then there are the nucleic acids, the keepers of our genetic code. And finally, lipids, which form our cell membranes and store energy. Let's start with proteins. If your body is a bustling city, proteins are the workers doing literally everything. They're built from long chains of amino acids that fold up into incredible shapes to do very specific jobs, transporting nutrients, fighting off germs as antibodies, carrying messages as hormones. You name it, a protein probably does it. Next up, polysaccharides. Think of these as your fuel and your scaffolding. They're just long chains of sugars. In plants, you see them as starch for energy or cellulose for structure. We store our energy as something similar called glycogen. The analogy of a cotton thread is perfect. It's a simple repeating chain, but it's incredibly important.
And of course, you can't build anything without the blueprints. That's where nucleic acids come in. DNA and RNA. These are also long polymers, and they contain all the instructions for building and running an entire organism. It's the information that gets passed down from one generation to the next.
All right, let's circle back and zoom way in on proteins, because how they work is just amazing. It's all about their shape. A protein isn't just some floppy chain of chemicals. It's a precisely folded 3D machine, and that structure is everything. It's what gives it its function. It all builds up in four distinct levels. First, you have the primary structure, which is just the simple, straight line of amino acids in a chain. Then, that chain starts to twist and fold into shapes like helices, kind of like a spiral staircase. That's the secondary structure.
The real magic happens at the tertiary level. This is where the whole thing folds back on itself into a complex 3D shape, like a hollow woolen ball. This is the point it becomes a functional machine, and some proteins even go one step further to a quaternary structure, where multiple folded chains team up, like the 4 parts of hemoglobin that carry oxygen in your blood.
Now for a special VIP class of proteins, enzymes. Almost all enzymes are proteins, and their job is to be nature's accelerators. They make chemical reactions happen. And not just happen, but happen at speeds that are just mind-boggling. Without enzymes, the chemistry of life would grind to a halt. To really get a sense of their power, check this out. In our bodies, we need to turn carbon dioxide and water into carbonic acid. Without an enzyme, that reaction produces maybe 200 molecules an hour. Pretty slow. But with an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase on the job, the rate explodes to 600,000 molecules every single second. From 200 an hour to 600,000 a second?
Yeah, let that sink in for a moment. That single enzyme makes the reaction 10 million times faster. That's not just a little boost. That's the difference between a chemical reaction that's basically useless for a living thing and one that can power life itself. It's just incredible.
So how on earth do they do it? Well, every chemical reaction needs a little push to get started, something called activation energy. You can think of it like a big hill. You have to push a boulder over to get it rolling down the other side. What an enzyme does is basically flatten that hill. It dramatically lowers the activation energy needed, making it way easier for the reaction to happen.
Okay, so we've journeyed from simple elements all the way up to these complex, super fast molecular machines. Let's zoom back out and put it all together. What are you actually made of at the end of the day?
Well, no surprise here, most of an average cell is water, a whole lot of water. But look what's number 2, proteins. They make up 10 to 15%, the biggest chunk of everything that isn't water. Then you've got your nucleic acids, your carbs, and your lipids. So that's the basic recipe, a watery soup that's absolutely jam-packed with protein machinery.
And that's really the magic of it, isn't it? Life is what happens when these non-living chemical parts, elements really, get assembled in just the right way to create this incredibly complex, dynamic system. We've gone from the chemistry of a rock all the way to the intricate dance of molecules that makes a cell tick.
Which leaves us with one last, kind of mind-bending question. We've seen the recipe and the ingredients, we've seen the machinery, but if all the parts, every single molecule, are themselves non-living, where does that spark of aliveness actually come from? It's a fascinating thought. Chemistry can tell us what we're made of, but maybe not the full story of what makes us alive.